Let's talk about horror. Loving horror or avoiding it might seem like just a personal preference, but it actually reveals much more about how we handle stress, how we relate to society, and how we think. Imagine sitting in a dark room, watching the screen as eerie music builds, and then bam, jump scare. Some people laugh, others flinch, and some are already halfway out the door. About 10 to 20% of us are what psychologists call sensation seekers, people who thrive on thrilling experiences. Think skydiving, extreme sports, or yes, watching horror movies. For them, horror shows feel like a controlled roller coaster as their brain's reward system is wired to enjoy the intense emotions by turning fear into fun with the rush of dopamine and endorphins. But for others, not so much. Particularly those with higher levels of neuroticism experience a flood of cortisol, the stress hormone, when they are scared. For them, fear doesn't feel exciting, it feels overwhelming. Horror isn't just about getting scared. They are also about mystery, suspense, and essentially problem solving. Movies like Get Out or The Sixth Sense keep us guessing, and our brain loves it. In fact, 80% of horror fans say they enjoy horror because it challenges not just their nerves, but their thinking. Horror becomes an avenue for sensory and cognitive engagement. And watching horror with friends amplifies this effect through emotional contagion. When we laugh nervously after a jump scare or turn to our friends during tense moments, these reactions feed into our social bonding, and horror becomes a group activity that is even more engaging and enjoyable. And here's a twist. Watching horror movies might actually help some of us deal with real-world stress. An interesting research by Matthias Klassen during the COVID-19 pandemic found that 60% of horror fans felt better equipped to handle real-life stress. Why? Because horror films act as a kind of exposure therapy, and horror fans had practiced managing fear in controlled environments. Over time, they built resilience to fear itself. But fear isn't the only way to build emotional resilience. Things like mindfulness, exercise, or even challenging ourselves with public speaking can all help strengthen our emotional endurance. Horror just happens to be a more thrilling way to practice. And what we find scary isn't just personal, it's cultural. Take Japanese horror, which is often steeped in supernatural themes, reflecting the country's deep connection to spirits and the afterlife. Meanwhile, Western horror often revolves around psychological fears, loss of control, societal collapse, or isolation. This is an example of cultural relativity, the idea that our social and cultural backgrounds heavily influence what we fear. Our favorite monsters aren't just nightmares. They are reflections of the anxieties we share with our communities. Even sensation seeking is not purely a personal trait. It can also be shaped by society. In some cultures or subcultures, risk-taking is celebrated. While our personality may steer us towards certain preferences, social influences have strong reinforcement on whether we embrace or avoid certain experiences. Horror then becomes a reflection of what a society values and fears most. Our love or hate for horror isn't static. It evolves with not just our environment but also age. When we are young, we might love fast-paced, jump-scare-filled movies. But as we get older, we tend to gravitate towards slower, psychological horror that makes us think rather than just react. Some people might even lose their taste for horror entirely, seeking different forms of entertainment as their priorities shift. Horror becomes a mirror for our personal and emotional growth, adapting as we change. So, what does horror say about us? A lot more than just whether we like to be scared. The next time we are watching a scary movie or skipping it, we are experiencing a mix of personal and societal influences.